Imagine standing on the edge of a frozen wasteland where the wind doesn't just blow, it bites. You have a pocket full of gold, but your stomach is screaming. In the 1897 Klondike Gold Rush, wealth didn't mean a thing if you couldn't find a calorie. Men died with bags of gold in their hands because they couldn't buy a single egg. Today we are uncovering the desperate, the dangerous, and the downright deadly things people ate to stay alive in the most unforgiving place on earth. You need to pay close attention to number 7, because it's a meal that shouldn't have been possible, and number 1. Well, that's the one that changed the definition of human survival forever. This wasn't cooking. This was a war against starvation. The journey to the gold fields wasn't a hike. It was a 1,000-mile gauntlet. To even be allowed into the Yukon, the Canadian government forced every person to carry 1 ton of supplies. 1 ton. If you didn't have it, they turned you back. But even with 2,000 pounds of food, the mountain didn't care. Sleds broke, horses died, and men grew desperate. This is where the true cost of gold began to be measured in bites. Number 12. Sourdough starter. You might think of this as a trendy bread today, but in the Alaskan wilderness, it was a literal lifeline. These miners were nicknamed sourdoughs for a reason. They carried a fermented glob of flour and water close to their bodies, tucked inside their shirts against their bare skin. Why? Because if the starter froze, it died. And if it died, they didn't eat. It was their only source of leavening, their only way to make fire-baked bread in a land where everything else turned to ice. They treated that dough like a living child. It was a symbiotic relationship. The man kept the dough warm, and the dough kept the man alive. That was enough. Number 11. Canned condemned beef. When the supply lines failed, the sharks moved in. Unscrupulous traders sold crates of canned meat that had been rejected by the military years prior. It was often tainted, metallic, and rotting inside the tin. But when the temperature hit 60 below, you don't ask about the expiration date. You eat the gray, salty mass and pray the botulism doesn't get you before the frostbite does. This was not food. This was a gamble with your life. Number 10. The mock apple pie. Imagine craving the taste of home so badly it hurts. There were no apples in the Yukon. Not for 1,000 miles. So miners got creative. They soaked hard crackers in water, added a massive amount of sugar and a splash of tartaric acid to mimic the tang of fruit, and baked it in a crust of lard. Looked like a pie. Felt like a pie. But it was a lie. It was a psychological tool to keep the mind from breaking when the body was failing. Number 9. Tallow and sawdust. This is where the extreme in our title truly begins. When the flour ran out, some miners were forced to stretch their remaining fat supplies. They would mix melted animal tallow, often from horses that had collapsed on the trail, with fine wooden sawdust. The sawdust provided bulk, tricking the stomach into feeling full, while the tallow provided the raw energy needed to keep the heart beating. It was a brutal, abrasive meal that tore through the digestive system, but it kept the fire inside burning for one more day. This was not cooking. This was strategy. Number 8. Boiled moccasins. This is the point where the gold meant absolutely nothing. When the sled dogs were gone and the dry goods were buried under 10 feet of snow, miners turned to their own gear. Traditional native footwear was made of moose or caribou hide, tanned with natural oils. In a state of total starvation, miners would boil their extra moccasins for hours, sometimes days, trying to soften the leather into a gelatinous, rubbery stew. It was essentially eating flavored glue. There was almost no nutrition in it, but the act of chewing kept the jaw moving and the mind focused on something other than the encroaching cold. Here's what no one tells you. Most people who reached this stage never made it back. The leather wasn't a meal. It was a white flag. Number 7. The $5 egg. In 1898, $5 could buy you a suit of clothes or a week's lodging in a city. In the Klondike, it bought you one single, potentially rotten egg. Because there were no chickens in the frozen north, eggs had to be hauled over the Chilkoot Pass, often freezing and thawing a dozen times along the way. When a shipment finally arrived in Dawson City, men would line up for hours, clutching their gold dust, just for a taste of something that wasn't dried or salted. It was the ultimate status symbol. If you were eating an egg, you were the king of the camp, even if that egg smelled like sulfur and regret. Number 6. Willow bark tea. Scurvy was the silent killer of the gold rush. Without vitamin C, your teeth loosen, your old wounds reopen, and your bones feel like they're shattering. When the lemons and limes ran out, miners watched the local indigenous people. They began stripping the inner bark from willow trees and steeping it in boiling water. It was bitter, astringent, and tasted like medicine, which it was. It contained salicin, a natural form of aspirin, and just enough nutrients to slow the rot. This was the only thing standing between a miner and a shallow grave in the permafrost. Number 5. Candles and axle grease. It sounds impossible, but in the dark of the Alaskan winter, fat is the only currency that matters. When the bacon was gone, miners looked at their lighting supplies. Tallow candles were made from rendered animal fat. They weren't just for light. They were emergency rations. Men would shave them into their coffee or chew on them raw. Even the grease used to lubricate the axles of their sleds was fair game if it was animal-based. It was disgusting. It coated the throat in a waxy film, but it provided the concentrated calories needed to survive a night at 70 below. This was not food. This was survival. This is where things change. We're entering the top 4, where the prices paid weren't just in gold. They were paid in the very soul of the men who went searching for it. The dead horse trail scraps. The path to the gold fields was littered with the carcasses of over 3,000 horses that collapsed from exhaustion and hunger. They called it the White Pass, but history remembers it as the Dead Horse Trail. When the winter food supplies failed to arrive, miners didn't just walk past these frozen remains. They hacked frozen chunks of meat from horses that had been dead for weeks, preserved only by the sub-zero temperatures. They would boil the stringy, lean meat over small fires of scrub brush. It was tough, it was gamey, and it was a reminder that on this trail, everything, man and beast, was eventually consumed by the land. Number 3. Flour paste and bone dust. Toward the end of the winter, the 1 ton of supplies was often down to the very bottom of the barrel. Literally, miners would scrape the white dust from the cracks of their flour barrels and mix it with water to create a thin, gray paste. To add volume, they would take the bones from previous meals, bones that had already been boiled 3 or 4 times, and grind them into a fine powder. This bone flour added calcium and a gritty texture to the paste. It was a meal of ghosts, made from the remnants of better days. That was enough. Number 2. Raw bear liver. In the desperate search for nutrients, a successful hunt for a polar or grizzly bear felt like a miracle. But the miracle had a hidden sting. Miners, starving for fresh meat, would feast on the bear's liver. What they didn't know was that bear liver contains toxic levels of vitamin A. Eating it caused hypervitaminosis A, leading to peeling skin, hair loss, liver failure, and even death. They were so hungry for life that they ate the very thing that poisoned them. This was not cooking. This was a tragedy. Number 1. The unknown stew. There are stories whispered in the journals of survivors, stories that the history books often leave out. When groups were trapped in cabins for months, buried under 20 feet of snow with no supplies left, the line between human and animal vanished. The unknown stew was the ultimate price. It was the meal eaten when there was nothing left but the person sitting across from you who didn't wake up that morning. It is the darkest chapter of the gold rush, a silent pact among survivors to never speak of what was in the pot. It cost a fortune in human life because, for some, the price of survival was their humanity itself. Looking back at these 12 meals, you realize the Alaskan gold rush wasn't really about the gold. It was a test of how much a human being can endure before they break. The gold stayed in the ground for millions of years, but these men only had a few days of hunger before they were forced to eat candles, leather, or worse. Next time you look at a simple meal, remember the sourdoughs who risked everything for a single $5 egg. Which one of these shocked you the most? Would you have had the strength to keep going? Let me know in the comments.